So here we are. This is our second hot takes, and we're joined by Eric and Gideon. Gideon, sorry, I get different pronunciations in different places. So Gideon actually was the host for the Did on Conference Africa, and Eric joined him.
Mhm.
And so here we are doing our little hot takes to find out what the trends are, what you guys are taking away from it, and hopefully you'll disagree with any about something with each other so that we can have some spicy debate. But if not, I will make up some spicy questions. So, yeah. So I guess we should start with Gideon because it was your event.
Well, I should start by thanking everyone and everyone at Diff for being a continued supporter of the event. And I think for those on the call that might not be familiar with Did UNCONF Africa, as it's come to be known, or what we called it for the past 2 years, is in a nutshell. DidOnConf Africa is Africa's first internet identity workshop. So it's done in partnership with the Internet Identity Workshop, or the IIW, as many of you will know it as well. And I should say that I might be the local kind of spearhead behind it, but there's a huge army, a coalition of the willing, so to speak, that make it happen together with me. Among those, Heidi Nubantu of the IIW as well. And it's really been quite an extraordinary journey. The whole event started as a hypothesis to say, can we do something like this in Africa? For the international identity community, Africa is kind of it's a long trek. It's quite far away and so on. But and I think the thing that was kind of reinforced or just reaffirmed this year is in Africa we sit with a very unique set of challenges that aren't so prevalent in the rest of the, call it, developing or developed world. Namely, we cannot rely on the ubiquitous access to smartphone technology or data or internet connectivity, etc., which makes the problem statements around digital identity a bit more nuanced and a bit more challenging. And I often say, kind of, Africa, and this is a overgeneralization, so take it with a pinch of salt. But Africa is kind of like New York in that way. If you can make it here, you can make it anywhere in terms of figuring out how to make digital identity work. And I think Did UnConf Africa has really become a melting pot where, the problem statements are clearly articulated and wrestled with over the course of 3 days. And what we've done in terms of the format is day one, we've treated as a more typical, call it, conference, where there is a familiar conference setting, especially to the South African demographic and typical conference ecosystem. So we have a couple of keynotes, we have a couple of panel discussions. Eric gave an extraordinary keynote address. And that then acts as a bridge from the familiar into the unfamiliar of the unconference, right? Which is a very unique format, which turns that whole thing on its head. So I think my first hot take was, I think it was a big success. We doubled the amount of attendance from year one to year two, which was this year, which was a good barometer to say, okay, we'll probably end up doing it again. So we'll confirm the dates for next year soon. We're busy looking at calendars and things like that, but I was very encouraged by the international attendance, through people like Eric and Glyph, etc. But then also the local ecosystem really kind of took off around it. And especially around public sector participation, which in the South African ecosystem, it's not always easy to get those big national players all in a room together. And even though we didn't get all of them, we got a lot of them. So no, I was very encouraged by just the blend of the audience which was there. Yeah.
Sorry, Grace, I can't disagree with a word that Gideon said. I came away very impressed with the robustness of discussion and interest in the topics that we had, and in particular around identity and payments. There's a very, very robust ecosystem in South Africa, which I would say exceeds that with which I'm familiar here in the U.S. It's more developed in a lot of ways. The ability of people to pay each other uh, conveniently uh, is better than exists here in the U.S. in many ways.
It's a bit of a low bar, but moving on.
True that.
Um, so what has really developed in South Africa around decentralized identity, and why do you think the government officials were coming to this? Because it's unusual to see government officials at an unconference. I mean, I have seen that in Europe. We did have that with DICE, but it is a little bit unusual.
Yeah, I think part of it has to do with, if I look both at kind of technology streams and the regulatory streams, South Africa has typically followed in the footsteps of a lot of either American or European initiatives, right? And there's a very, call it close lens on what's happening in the EU and EIDAS at the moment from a South African perspective. So, kind of a lot of the thinking around decentralized identity, digital identity, financial identity aims to follow in the, well, is following the breadcrumbs which are strewn there because uh, geographically, at least in our immediate region, which is called the SADC region, the Southern African Democratic Congress, which is a host of countries kind of congregated towards the southern tip of Africa. There's a parallel between the EU member states and interoperability and how that could be mimicked here in the SADC countries or the African Union countries, right? And that a lot of the use cases that pop up routinely here is around, and this touches on Eric's point around payments, the intersection of identity and payments around cross-border, what's the word I'm looking for? Remuneration or remittance, right? Sending money between countries. And I think the Grace, to touch on your question, the I think the why the lens is so acutely on digital slash decentralized identity is a lot of these solutions aim to look for some kind of, call it best of both worlds approach, where there is some kind of oversight by a national body for regulatory purposes, but that you don't want to create a nation state or a surveillance state, that you still have a decentralized citizen-centric component to it as well. That's, I'm hesitant to speak on the behalf of a bunch of governmental or national departments, but that I would feel comfortable saying is a overall intent or question worth asking of a lot of the public sector bodies is how do we solve that problem? And decentralized identity forms a very important component of that, especially towards the citizen, right?
I will say I heard a lot of talk about the work coming out of the state of Utah in the U.S., which I think has very, very similar goals to those that you just described.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. And I mean, I think look, I can talk about the event forever because I'm super passionate about it. But Eric, I'd be keen on from your perspective, you've highlighted kind of the payments and identity as a
Hmm.
kind of leading pillar or a theme of this year's event.
Sure.
Are there other things that popped up that are unique or maybe even contrary to some of the other kind of decentralized identity events or initiatives that you are aware of in the rest of the world?
Hmm. Um, I can't say that any particular contrasts come to mind. There was a lot of interest in work being done elsewhere, and obviously, I brought in a perspective from the content provenance ecosystem that I think was new to the South African audience, but very interesting to a lot of people there. Um, but I can't say that aside from payments, which I thought was perhaps more mature in some ways, anything that struck me as particularly at odds with the North American perspective that I have.
Yeah. No, I definitely, in terms of the content provenance, it's something that I was particularly drawn to because my history is not in technology, it's in
Right.
media. So I think in some of the conversations leading up to the event, Eric and I found one another on this wavelength.
Yeah.
So you said maybe you can find something that we can disagree on. I think we actually found one another quite quickly.
True
It's even
that. And there were a
hopefully.
number of other people who had other media perspectives at the conference, so I found that quite interesting.
Yeah, yeah. I
Say
think
more about
something,
that.
say again, sorry.
Like, what were the different yeah, say more about the disagreement and the different perspectives, because I think that's what's really interesting to people. Like, where was there different perspective on this content question?
I wouldn't say that there were, disagreements, and sorry to disappoint you on that front, but what I did see, we had some representatives, I think, from South African Broadcasting, and maybe a couple of other national or commercial broadcast TV production, that kind of thing, that were either national or regional in scope. And they're basically, explaining the sort of depths of the closed loop identity system that they've built for translating data and making sure that advertising provenance and rights provenance and so forth get transmitted within their particular ecosystems, but also realizing that when they cross borders, and especially when they cross regions, that becomes dramatically more difficult. And that's, solved problem sort of, but it's not one that they're real comfortable with the solution to. If I can characterize that correctly, does that ring true?
Yeah, and I think maybe to add to that, something that I took away from it is, in our daily lives, we speak as technologists working for companies. So we think about a solution that addresses a functional problem by and large, right? How do we get from A to B? Okay, cool.
Hmm.
This little component or this little API call can work. But when it comes to content provenance and content creation, especially in terms of the times we all live in, is what I was left with is um, you know, just solving the technology problem or just considering the technology problem is not enough to the extent that even the sexiest technological solution won't be adopted if you don't think about the rest of the components. So when
Hmm.
it comes to content, things like the ethics of ownership, uh, and when it comes to identity, what happens when I create something and that is tweaked or augmented, etc. So you might be able to prove the provenance, but how does ownership and remuneration of rights and reuse of that content look down the line? So that's something that yeah, that still sits with me, regardless of whether you're focusing on content or other areas of identity. To come back to the South African context, there are many solutions kind of bubbling to the surface that we are all becoming increasingly aware that if we do not consider what the adoption perspective of this looks like from a national scale, or the rollout, or the marketing component, or how it's received or digested or accepted, the tech can be amazing. It can solve all the problems in the world. If you can't articulate it and speak to all of these other components as well, that in and of itself is won't be enough. Yeah.
See,
I
Juan's
see.
hand is up.
Well, on that point, I was kind of curious. You mentioned there was a lot of talk about provenance and content credentials, and you also mentioned there's a lot of payments talk. I was wondering how the SADC crowd sees cryptocurrencies and
Mhm.
uh, sort of fiat payments. Are these oil and water, or were there some people interested in dabbling or on ramping and off ramping?
Yeah, I mean, be careful what you wish for in terms of a conversation, but I think South Africa actually globally or per capita is one of the quickest and highest adopter of cryptocurrencies worldwide, and for all of these reasons, elegant cross-border transactions, etc. There is a big stablecoin, kind of call it revolution, happening in the region as well, specifically around tokenization and how tokenization of identity maps to stablecoin payments and then by extension, crypto payments. So no, that's very much part of the narrative. And then how that relates back to identity, obviously, is how does one achieve a kind of, call it as we know, KYC in the traditional business sense, this concept of KYT, of know your transaction, without well, still in a, call it, privacy preserving manner, right? That you don't have a whole fraud explosion, but that you are able to send money across borders responsibly, etc. So that crypto becomes a huge part of that conversation.
We have a question in the chat, and we have Eric's hand up, and I definitely have more questions about the crypto thing. But yeah, go ahead, Eric, and then I'll ask the question that was in the chat.
Okay. One of the things I came away observing, I've sort of seen this elsewhere, but I'm starting to be aware of, back to Gideon's point about the technology and the breadth of it, is I think we come in with the content provenance ecosystem and CAI with a technology that aims to be very broad in its scope. So it, intends to cover many different forms of digital media. And what we're finding is when we start to touch with industry specific experts is that each industry has its own fairly complicated set of things that they need in their industry. Musicians have specific form of musician identity and sound technologist identity, and the relationships between those and the various ways that they compose things into a final piece of recorded music. And it's a very different set of things than, for instance, the motion picture industry has, and very different from live broadcast TV or so on and so forth. And so I think one of the struggles that we'll have is to have both breadth and enough depth to appeal to each of these different industries that we're attempting to reach. And then I'll just echo what I said in the chat, that I felt like crypto was much more broadly discussed as a payment mechanism in this conference than I have seen in North America or Europe conferences in a few years. An interesting contrast there.
Cool. All right. So, I'm going to have to put on my glasses in order to read this question that came from the audience. And also, people in the audience, feel free to raise hands and ask questions. So, Senkarshan asks about countries in Africa that are making headway in adopting decentralized digital ID initiatives and perhaps looking at it as digital public infrastructure.
Mm.
And then Sede also asked, what is the state of decentralized identity in other African countries, for example, West Africa? So I think those are pretty much the same question.
Mm. Yeah, I can briefly touch on that. I will say as a almost as a disclaimer or a ambition of Did UNCONF Africa, we've put the tagline as bridging the digital identity gap in Africa. But something that we have yet to get right is substantial attendance from other African countries. We invite them and so on and that and I don't know if it's a symptom of the identity community that we've come to know is more and large a international one. So there's great international attendance, and the local South African attendance this year was fantastic. But that is an ambition of not only mine, but us as the organization as a whole to get greater African attendance in there. So some of the examples that come to mind that maybe touches on both of those questions that kind of includes DPI as well is MOSIP, the modular open source identity platform, has quite a fantastic footprint in and around Africa, right? I think I speak under correction, but they are active to some stage or another in about 17. That's the last number I heard. Um, in countries in Africa. Now, that's not to say that those are active and running. They might be at some stage of discovery or negotiation, but the one that I am really quite drawn to is all of the fantastic work done in Ethiopia over the last couple of years around Fayda and FaydaPass. And the reason I kind of single out that one as it pertains to decentralized identity is FIDA, the call it national identity component, is built on MOSIP, and that's run by the government. And then in public-private partnership, FaydaPass, which sits on top of it as the verifiable credentialing layer, is a decentralized component like that. All of the wallet logic sits there, the credential logic sits there. And that, to touch on what I was talking about earlier around this, call it hybrid models popping up all over the place. Um, at least I haven't been to Ethiopia to experience it and play around with it and so on, but at least what I've heard with it, and I've spoken to the guys of both the Ethiopian government and the guys that developed FaydaPass, seems to be to my mind, quite a good example of what the questions in the chat are getting towards. I think the challenge there always is the rollout and the adoption, and there again you look to public-private sector partnerships with the banking industry, the insurers, the telecommunications providers, those with big nation scale um, bases. Yeah. I hope that answers some of the or provides some color to the question. Yeah.
That's really great. I said we're getting close to the top of the hour. I wanted to talk about the hot topic, which is agentic AI. Did it come up at all? Everywhere I've gone, it's come up. Did it come up at all?
Yeah, I think it again around payments specifically as well. That became a big topic there. I think something else where agentic AI also kind of poked its head up is call it delegated authority, where especially in a call it a more a business identity component. So if you register a business and you appoint directors of that business, some of those directors might have signatory power for transactions or you have a treasurer or a secretary or whatever. So how does one over time automate or streamline a agent that can act on your behalf, but with your blessing in a particular strata of business, right? That's a big component to solve for in many of these kind of national initiatives at the moment, because there's a lot of consideration around personal identity or citizen identity, but there is still some wrestling to do with, okay, organizational identity. And obviously organizations like Life and so on are doing great work there, but how does that relate to agentic AI, to come back to your question? Yeah.
Cool. So maybe just last words, because I know that at the top of the hour, there's the next meeting. Oh, Eric has his hand up, so maybe you'll
Yeah,
have the last
yes,
word. We're
I
about to
was,
find
yes.
out.
Yes, I was moving for some last words. I just want to say that a couple of plugs here that I want to make for the conference. One, the robustness of the discussion was wonderful. I really enjoyed that. Also, South Africa and especially Cape Town are just amazing places to go explore. So, whether you're
Hmm.
coming from Namibia or from the Northwest U.S. as I was, it is worth the trip. Please go when Gideon announces his dates for next year. It is worth it.
Thanks, Eric. That's very generous of you. And it was great having you. Yeah.
Thank you.
And for all of those of you on the call not in South Africa, come on. We'll tell you
Yes.
a good time.
Right. Well, that's fabulous. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for your hot takes. And we haven't announced this or even discussed it yet, but I probably would do some sort of review of some of the stuff. I've been to 6 different countries, I think, and I'll be back next week. And so maybe next month I'll give a little review of all these really various and, it'll be kind of random things that I saw. But yeah,
Wonderful. Look forward to it.
yeah, yeah. All right. Well, for those of you who are cold or hot, I guess that was a wrap for our second round of hot takes. Thank you.
All righty. Thank you so long.
Thanks,
Thanks.
everybody.